Good afternoon, everyone. How is everyone today? Well, welcome. Welcome to this really remarkable and special Gettysburg College event. And I'm really impressed on such a good day outside. You guys chose to be here with us. We talk a lot here, as you know, about consequential education and what it means to live a consequential life and in service to something bigger than yourself, to the greater good. It's the heart of everything that we seek to do here. Today, you're going to have an opportunity to learn from a person who has led a truly consequential life, a person who has deepened our understanding of the American history, the American story, and the responsibilities to each of us, entrusted to each of us to contribute our own verse to it. And of course, I'm speaking today about our honored guest, world-renowned documentarian and friend of the college, Ken Burns. There have been very few individuals in our nation's history who have had such a profound impact in shaping American discourse than Ken Burns. And in a moment, Professor Udden will help to contextualize the impact that Ken has had on the art of filmmaking and on our culture more broadly, and how his timeless works have challenged us to grapple with the defining issues of our time. But before I turn over the microphone, Ken, again, on behalf of the entire Gettysburg community, the students here today, the faculty, the staff, the broader Gettysburg Borough community, I want to express my deepest thanks for your joining us today and sharing with us your experience, your wisdom, your perspective, and especially with our students. And I want to call out particularly today's focus on activism and protest. You all know this, but just up the road here, Abraham Lincoln spoke about the importance of advancing the unfinished work of our democracy. The starting point for that work is a willingness to get engaged, to be heard, to challenge the status quo. Students, we tell stories for a reason. There is power in narrative. It's a catalyst for change. Today, you're going to hear from one of the best ever to do it. Be curious, ask questions, and enjoy this wonderful occasion. Thank you all. Now, please join me in welcoming Professor Jim Udden.
I need to make an announcement first, and this is going to be a little ironic given the nature of today's event, but please no photos or videos today, including of me, please. If there is one word I would use to describe Ken Burns, it would be impact. One sign of impact is familiar to anyone who has used iMovie, which is Apple's editing software included on every Mac. There is a setting for inserting still images simply called the Ken Burns effect. Now, two things stand out here. One, there is no need to explain what that means. Two, it is the default setting. Now, I can personally attest to the impact of Ken Burns, and I am hardly alone when I say this. In 1990, I was living in Taiwan, and I was studying Chinese while teaching English. Every day, my Chinese got better, while my English seemed to get worse. Back home, my mother decided to record a new series on PBS called The Civil War. She put them on VHS tapes and sent them to me. And back then, by the way, you could fit up to 6 hours on a single VHS tape. It was arguably the first time that I ever binged watch a TV show. Now, at that point, being a recent college graduate with a history major, I expected little and arrogantly thought I already knew the Civil War well enough. Instead, I not only learned how little I actually knew about the Civil War, I felt I had just seen the war for the first time despite all I had read previously. Indeed, that is largely true of everyone who has seen that show. It literally shaped how we now see the war. What was once so long ago was suddenly now. I am a baseball fan, and I long thought I knew its history well. But it turns out, I only knew that history mostly in a statistical sense. I never saw and experienced the history of the American pastime until I saw Ken Burns' baseball. For those who have seen that show, think of Branch Rickey, innovator of the farm system, the batting helmet, and the person who first let Jackie Robinson play in 1947. I'm also old enough to remember the last years of the Vietnam War. Don't be shocked at that. I saw glimpses of that war on TV even. Yet once again, I never really felt I saw and lived that war until seeing Ken Burns' The Vietnam War. Moreover, I watch every episode of that show with my wife from Taiwan, whose experience of that war was very different than it was for Americans. Yet she said something while seeing all the tumult that had occurred in the United States in the 1960s. She said, "How is any of that different than the United States today?" In a word, impact. That ability to make something that seems so remote and make us realize it is what we are today. Without further ado, I give you Ken Burns.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I'm honored to be back at Gettysburg. I've been here at college many times before. I have the distinct honor of having received an honorary degree in the early 90s from this wonderful place. Although I told people earlier when I looked at the podium, another honorary degree recipient who was not giving the commencement as I was John Lewis, the representative from Georgia who passed away. And I thought, this is a big mistake. And I said that to him, and he said, no, it's okay. You've got something to say. First of all, let me inoculate myself from both of your generous introductions. I have in my home in New Hampshire, where I've lived for 44 years, an old and now faded New Yorker cartoon that shows three men standing in hell, the flames licking up around them. And one guy says to the other two, apparently my over 200 screen credits didn't mean a damn thing. And of course they don't. And maybe just a little bit of balm for you, Jim, is that Harry Truman is supposed to have said, the only thing that's really new is the history you don't know. And I think when we begin to approach what the dynamics of what we're talking about is what you're saying about what the possibility of story is. Story is the editing of human experience. How was your day? Produces a story. You don't say, I back slowly down the driveway avoiding the garbage can at the curb unless somebody T-bones you, and that's exactly the way you set it up. We edit human experience, and how we do that is really the mark of how we tell stories. And when we think about it, we are in a computer and a media age in which everything is binary, when we know, in fact, from our lives, nothing is binary. Everything's a 1 or a 0 in the computer world. Everything is good or bad, black or white, red state or blue state, young or old, rich or poor, gay or straight, whatever it might be. And they're impossible dialectic to ever reconcile. But stories do that. They help us understand that. The novelist Richard Powers said, the best arguments in the world won't change a single person's point of view. The only thing that can do that is a good story. And sometimes that change doesn't happen. Sometimes it happens fully and transformationally. Sometimes it happens at the margin. But that's where our experience is given an opportunity to grow, where we're able to synthesize the impressions that we take in and to produce something that moves us forward on our own journeys or collectively. And so I have been engaged in taking these very, very long films. Very kindly, you didn't say that the VHS tests of the Civil War were almost 12 hours and the Vietnam was almost 20 hours. And we've started something called Unum, out of the Latin motto of the United States, E pluribus unum, out of many one, and looking to curate the evergreen facts of American history. So, you know, we like to say, completely fraudulently, that history repeats itself. It never has. There's never been an event that has happened exactly the same way. Or we like to say that we're condemned to repeat what we don't remember. It's a very lovely sentiment. It's also not true. Mark Twain is supposed to have said history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And if he did say that, he is dead on. Ecclesiastes, which is the Old Testament, might have it best. What has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There's nothing new under the sun. That seems to suggest that human nature doesn't change, and that human nature superimposes itself on the seemingly random chaos of events. And yet therefore we hear the echoes, we see the motifs, the recurring themes, the rhymes, if you will. And I don't know of a single film out of 40 that I've made that I haven't been aware while I was making it of how much it was rhyming at the past, or more correctly, once we finish doing it, because we're in no way trying to point arrows at moments, how much it rhymes, as your wife saw in the Vietnam with the present. The last film we released in the fall was called The U.S. and the Holocaust. When we began it in 2015 in a very different America, we thought nothing of the fact that we would release it this coming fall in 2023. But as we began working on it, as the United States changed, the rhyming that was occurring, as it does in any film, was accelerating. So instead of rhyming on every page of the script, it was rhyming in every sentence, and not in good ways, that it became incumbent upon us to accelerate the production and put it out. Anyway, Unum is a way for us to distill and curate, much as you might make a mixtape of something, the scenes from the film in which those rhymes are most apparent between the subject matter, not with the present, but with the subject matter, and it remains to be seen whether some of those internal rhymes also suggest connections with our present moment. And so today, we've got a short mixtape, if you will, from several different films that my colleagues who work on the Unum and I have put together for you this afternoon on activism and protest. And I hope that what it does is activate in you something in the interconnectedness. I like to see this, the work that I do in terms of textile. When you're weaving, there's a warp and a woof, and I don't have any film that I've ever worked on that isn't in some way by association connected to another film. And so the warp and woof of American history is as important to me internally and emotionally as are the rhymes that are ever present. So without further ado, we'll look that out. I'll be back, and I look forward to a conversation about that. Thank you so much for your attention on a Sunday. I'm from New Hampshire. This is like summer. And so I'm very glad you're here and look forward to it. Thank you.
So now it's your opportunity to ask Mr. Burns questions. So if you have a question, just raise your hand. I'll bring the microphone to you. Please identify yourself and perhaps tell us what your major area of study is.
Chris Singleton, Cinema Media Studies major. One thing watching that, your appeal to emotion in these documentaries when focusing on facts is remarkable. Can you speak to how you're able to expose these emotions in different interviews and moments in history, please?
That's a wonderful question. It's interesting, we were just talking about that. I was trying to raise money for my very first film, 50 years ago. And I said that I was uninterested in excavating merely the dry dates and facts and events of the past, but I was interested in an emotional archaeology that might be the glue that would hold them together. I'm not sure I really understood fully what I was writing. I was just trying to raise money, and I was in my mid-20s, and I looked like I was 12, and people were delighting in telling me no, particularly because I was trying to sell them the Brooklyn Bridge. And I did have one say, "This child is trying to sell me the Brooklyn Bridge," laughed in my face and slammed the door. It was like that. But I don't mean to, emotional is a really good word, but I just want to qualify it. You're not talking about, and I'm not talking about sentimentality or nostalgia, which are the enemies of good anything. What we're talking about are the higher emotions that our founders actually thought would be released if people could govern themselves. The pursuit of happiness. Uniformly, people think that's mysterious and inscrutable, and I suppose it is in our dumber down age, but they didn't mean the acquisition of objects in a marketplace of things. They meant lifelong learning in a marketplace of ideas, and that out of that, emotions would be produced. And I'm not sure that I could actually articulate what the process is. in the way a rule book or a manual might, because the manual would still be kind of dependent on those kind of binary sorts of things. Don't hammer it this way, hammer it that way. And so I would almost invite you to watch the process of it, but you've hit the nail on the head of what I'm interested in, is an emotional archaeology, and to appeal to that higher things. And a lot of it is, Wynton Marsalis in our jazz series said to me, this would have been mid-90s, he said, sometimes a thing and the opposite of a thing are true at the same time. We know this in our lives, but we don't practice it anywhere else, you know, or really bring that. And I think that that's maybe that kind of reconciliation or tolerance of that complexity, that undertow that is inevitable. In our editing room, we have a little neon sign in cursive, very small and discreet, that says, it's complicated. Because there's not a filmmaker, as you know, in the world that if a scene is working, you don't want to touch it. But we always find new and contradictory information which we have to put in, you know. You could see the way the rhymes of this thing, right? You've got somebody who's refusing to go into the military. The next person has gone into the military and is agonized over it. That's Tim O'Brien, who wrote the single greatest book about the Vietnam War called The Things We Carry. He is still, decades afterwards, as you saw him there, still carrying all of that guilt and all of the collective guilt of everyone else who went or did not go. And I've known him for years and years, and it is a wonder he is still alive, because he holds up a much bigger mountain than anybody else. In fact, Muhammad Ali was clean, you know, really clean about it. And so he understood. And Tim is tortured to this moment by that decision. And being able to do that, or to say, for example, in another rhyme, you know, that the great thing is Tommy Vallely, who got a distinguished something or other from the Marines for unbelievable action, which we covered earlier in the film, said it was a disrespectful loyalty. You know, it gave the title of this episode of the Vietnam film, because I just thought it was like, what a great phrase, a disrespectful loyalty. And that's the essence, is it not, of kind of activism and protest. You know, someone asked Frederick Douglass at the end of his life if they had any advice. And he said, agitate, 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 which I just think is, it's it, right? You know, it keeps things at least fresh.
Mr. Burns, my name is Zeev Karmi. I'm a history major, concentrating on public history. And so I wanted to thank you for coming before I ask my question. But as someone who's studying public history, I know one of our challenges of our art is taking academic history and making it something accessible to the general public. And from what I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, please, but you weren't trained as a historian, you were trained in film.
Right.
So I'm curious, how did you, who's trained in film, pick up these tactics of history and bringing history to the common public? And conversely, what recommendations would you make for someone who is an academic historian and wants to convert that academic history to something digestible by the public?
Yeah, what a wonderful, wonderful question. My path is so singular, as I think it is for most documentary filmmakers. You know, if you want to be a lawyer or a doctor or a, you know, I can tell you how to do it, right? But I don't know if I could tell you precisely how to be a filmmaker. You know, I am a filmmaker. That's what I do. I'm not a historian. I happen to have chosen just who I am, making history. Fortunately, the word history is mostly made up of the word story plus high, which is a good way to begin one. And, you know, that's, I can tell you, it would take too long and waste your time, the accidents of doing that, but I have been making history for almost 50 years. It's, the important thing is that we are rooted in scholarship, but we're not defined by it. A story is a narrative, and for most of the telling of history, it's been narrative history. But at the dropping of the atomic bomb at the end of the Second World War, everything really changes, right? The 60 or so million human beings extinguished in the course of that relatively short war changes everything. So what happens is that the actual process of historiography, as we call it, undergoes some radical changes, and history becomes susceptible, I don't want to say to fashions, but to movements and approaches. So at the beginning it's Freudian, later it's Marxist economic sort of determinist theories, there's semiotics, there's symbolism, there's deconstruction, there's modernism, there's queer studies, there's Afrocentrism, there's lots of ways to see that. But all of them don't represent a failure. They're perfectly legitimate academic pursuits. But what they've abandoned is a dependency on narrative, just telling a story. It may not be always and then and then and then, but it's mostly that. And so what we've done is we surround ourselves with scholars. The Vietnam film, for example, we had 23 scholars. Each one of them were cutting edge. We had one guy who had listened to who was studying all the tapes of Johnson and Nixon. Believe it or not, they have not all been listened to, and they were nowhere near transcribed. And we got copies of the tapes, and we would just listen to them for hours on end. And suddenly you go, wait a second. And we found something that they had not even cataloged, conversation between Kissinger and Nixon that is just, I mean, so damning as to be frightening in the fact that this was said in the Oval Office of the United States. Another person knew about Vietnamese military tactics from newly declassified Vietnamese stuff. And every time we'd have a meeting, which is 5 or 6 times, they would all be looking at each other like they were hearing new things. So the Vietnam series was an opportunity to aggregate everything that was known about the Vietnam War and present the most recent stuff. And I would say, even though the film came out in 2017, it's still probably the single, and it's really rare to say this about a film, it's probably still the single best source for the totality of the war, right? There are many works that go into much greater depth on any particular subject, of course, and the scholarship there is much more rigorous than the storytelling. But I think it just goes back to what I was saying in the introduction. It's like, what is the essence of a story? We are all prisoners in a really good way of Aristotle, right? Whose poetics tells us that we need a beginning and a middle and an end, and we need a climax and a denouement, and we need to have protagonists and antagonists and character developments and all of those things. And it's not that you go and you check them off in a box. You just in your gut know that that's what you want to do. And so it'll reveal itself. It speaks to you, and that's probably the biggest help I could give you at this stage, is that we don't know what we're doing. We listen to the material and it tells us. We listen to the scholars and it tells us. And then when it speaks back to us, we have the opportunity to make it better.
Hello, I'm Ben McCarley, a music education major with a Civil War Studies minor. So in my own historical analysis and research, I found that memory in historical events or emotions that really tie through memory as being one of the most important aspects of telling said history. So within maybe your first film to even now with your Unum project, how would you say your perceptions of using memory and emotions have changed?
Oh, what a wonderful question. All of the questions are so thoughtful. You know, memory is unstable, right? And inherently unstable. And any cop will tell you this, you know. The person who witnessed, the 10 people who witnessed the event will tell it 10 different ways. It's a Rashomon, and all of life is that. And yet there is a kind of certainty about it that it is conversely possible to use it. What I try to do is combine varieties of memory. So if you were to look at our scene in the Civil War series on the 3rd day of the Battle of Gettysburg here, you know, Pickett's charge, it's for about 1.5 pages of our script, there's no narration. It's just first-person voices, just describing what they saw. Some of it are severed heads going one direction, bodies going another. I mean, some of it's pretty ghastly because it's one of those horrible examples of the meat grinder of war. But in the totality, something begins to happen. And that's what I think is that, you know, when you put one thing together with another, you've also got a third thing, do you not? And I think in a way, there's a little bit of particle physics going on. There are free electrons given off, particularly because of the instability of memory. It allows you to sort of help to underscore the complexity and the fact that nothing is really ever all one thing. Do you know what I'm saying? And so that's the only way I could answer it. It's too vague to really satisfy you, but it's both the essence, but you have to be, you know, as Gorbachev said, trust but verify, right? You have to always be very, very careful about it. But it does provide you access to that emotional dimension, right? And it just want to make sure that the tail doesn't wag the dog in this case.
Hi, Graydon Verisco. And I don't have a major yet, but I'm interested in history. My question is, considering he's a bit of a controversial figure, especially as of late, what was it like to interview Shelby Foote, and do you have any thoughts on him now?
It was wonderful. I had made a film on Huey Long and had interviewed Robert Penn Warren, the great novelist and poet. He wrote a novel called All the King's Men, which is very loosely based on Huey Long's life. And we were able to interview him. And he heard that I was making a film about the Civil War. And he called me up one evening and told me that I should interview Shelby Foote right away. So I did. And I got to be good friends with him. I think what's happened in the kind of culture we're in right now is that his southernness has blinded people to the fact that he had a southern perspective because, guess what? He was a southerner, but he didn't have a southern bias in it. And what he produced is a 3-volume, 3,000-page work of literature that is the equal of Gibbon and Macaulay. If you're going to get into studying history, you might bump into those two English gentlemen about, you know, in the quality of it. And so if you'll read just the introduction to one of the books, his takedown of Orval Faubus, who was the segregationist governor of Arkansas, ought to lay aside some of the histrionics that have sort of attended to him.
My name is Alvin. I'm a sophomore. I'm a theater arts major and a cinema and media studies minor. Your work is very impressive, and globally you're recognized as a legendary filmmaker. My question is, how and when did you know that filmmaking was what you wanted to do for the rest of your life?
So my mother had cancer when I was 2 or 3. There was never a moment in my life when she was not dying and I was not aware of that. And you can imagine that that sort of didn't have a childhood. Let me just say that. I was told that she was going to die when I was 7 years old in the 2nd grade. And she died just a few months short of my 12th birthday when I was 11, as I was about to go into, you know, 7th grade. Afterwards, my father had a very strict curfew for my younger brother and me, but he forgave it for me on a school night if there was a movie on TV that might go to 1 a.m. on a school night for me to watch. And he would take me out to the local cinema and at the University of Michigan, where we were living at that time, to its, you know, film society program. And one night at home, we were watching a movie called Odd Man Out by Sir Carol Reed about the ongoing troubles in Ireland, this time in the late teens, early 20s. And the character, the main character played by James Mason, dies at the end with his lover. He's robbed a bank, he's killed a cop, and he's gunned down. And my father wept, and I'd never seen my father cry. Not when my mother was sick, not when she died, not at her impossibly sad funeral. A fact not lost on a lot of people, of my friends, who kind of whispered about it. And I realized instantaneously then, I was now 12, that my father had had a pretty hard time in life. There was no real place where he could express emotion, and that this was a world where he felt comfortable. It gave him a kind of safe harbor, do you know what I mean, to express who he was. And I vowed right then and there that I was going to be a filmmaker. And that meant at that time that I was going to go to Hollywood. I would try to be like Alfred Hitchcock or John Ford or Howard Hawks, who were 3 great movie directors of the 50s and 60s. I ended up going to Hampshire College, a new experimental school that was, I went its second year in the fall of '71, and all the teachers there were social documentary still photographers and filmmakers, and they reminded me quite correctly that there is as much drama in what is and what was as anything the human imagination, fiction, dreams up. And so I very quickly found myself interested in documentary, and then in reasons that are related to an earlier question, I found myself drawn inextricably to stories about history. And I'd always been interested in history, but if you told me, you know, you're going to be 45 years later still making films on American history, I would just said, you're crazy and out of your mind. But many years later, I was having a crisis of my own brought on by other events, and my late father-in-law, who was an eminent psychologist, I said to him just offhand, it looks like I'm still keeping my mother alive. I can't remember, I'm never present for the anniversary of her death. I'm always thinking that the day is approaching or it's past, and I missed it. And he goes, yeah, and I bet you blew out your birthday candles wishing she'd come back. And I said, how did you know? And he said, look what you do for a living. And I said, excuse me? He said, you wake the dead. You make Jackie Robinson and Abraham Lincoln come alive. Who do you think you're really trying to wake up? That's why I'm a filmmaker.
My name is Mike Berry. I'm a history major.
Where are you? I don't... wait.
Right here.
Oh, there you are. Sorry.
My question is, which film do you believe had the most profound impact on how we as Americans view or even question our history?
Which of the films that I don't know how to say that. You know, there's no favorite film, but I also know that, you know, it's hard to deny the centrality of the Civil War in who we are. It's the most defining event in American history. Everything that came before it, including our founding, and I'm working on a film right now, a major series on the history of the American Revolution, which is super tough without any photographs. But it's all prologue, because we know where we're founded, Philadelphia, we know what day, we know what it is. The second sentence, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I'm going to stop there because the guy who wrote that owned hundreds of human beings in his lifetime and didn't see the contradiction or the hypocrisy, and never saw fit, more importantly in his lifetime, to free any of those human beings that had the same rights as him. So the Civil War was fought over that. It's something that's still going on. Let's remember that the Confederate Army has not disbanded. It's still here, unfortunately. And that there's a lot of work to do. So the centrality of the Civil War makes it super important, but you know, the poet William Blake, English poet William Blake, said you could find the world in a grain of sand, you know, and it's sort of the cosmology of things. The religious disciplines often say as above, so below. The architecture of the atom is similar to the architecture of the solar system. There is a sense, though, that even in the smallest and most particular of moments, that you can actually gain an insight into the whole thing, that you are able to have revealed an essence of who we are, which is the animating thing of all of the work I've done. Who are we? I mean, and in some ways, as I've said many, many times before, I've made the same film over and over again, and each one asks that deceptively simple question about who we are. So I think that if you were going to just on, you know, it's like saying Babe Ruth, you know, or George Washington, or, you know, Tom Brady, whatever it is, you just sort of have something that's unassailable, and at the same time, you might have an access to the whole thing in a kind of minute gesture. You know, Ron Farisi's the helicopter pilot who threw his medal away, and we've been following him throughout the series. He's just he's like a grenade whose pin has been pulled. He is about to explode, and we did the interview 40 years after, right? He's still about to explode, and there's something incredibly telling in that, or just in Tim O'Brien's particular grief over what he didn't do. I mean, he did what everybody expected him. His country sent him a draft notice. He went into the draft. He went there. He fought. He came home, right? But he carried. I mean, I don't know if any of you have read. It's fairly standard, but if you haven't read, and you're interested at all in this period, or even in the sense of what I'm talking about, who we are, the things we carry to is a phenomenal thing.
All right. Hi, my name is Cameron Council back here. I am a sophomore majoring in history and anthropology and minoring in public history and Civil War era studies. And so my question to you is that, was there a film that was particularly hard to make, either emotionally or technically, either because of the subject matter or because of the process it took to make?
Yeah, a lot of them have been super, super hard. Obviously the first one, because you kind of are inventing a wheel. The Civil War, because it represented a multi-part series when a lot of our traditional funders said, well, nobody can be interested in still photographs for more than an hour. And then it had the dynamics of of having to reject the upside down history that we're often told. And people like to quote, the idea that the victors write the history. Not in our case. Not in our case, right? In at least regard to the Civil War or its aftermath, the losers actually wrote the history. And the two most famous films about the Civil War are, feature films are Birth of a Nation, 1915, and Gone with the Wind, 1939. Both of them posit that a homegrown terrorist organization, like the ISIS or Al-Qaeda, are the heroes of the story, of the post-war story, restoring white supremacy and order to a situation. And it's not true. So handling that, I would say right now, in retrospect, the two most complicated have been Vietnam and the most recent one, the US and the Holocaust, because you're in both those cases third rails, in proximity of a third rail almost all the time. The scholarship is incredibly complicated with Vietnam, and of course the Holocaust stuff is so tied up with our own deliberate, intentional forgetting and misrepresentation and latent and overt anti-Semitism that's been present throughout almost all of human history, and it's very, very complicated. And both of those films, plus the Second World War and Vietnam, were emotionally hard to do just because of the suffering and the loss. But I don't think I've cried more in my own film making at scenes over and over again as when Jackie or Louis Armstrong in jazz died. So I don't know how to tell you that. Sometimes that emotion has the kind of cathartic release that perhaps my father felt watching Odd Man Out, or some other thing. But just the process for me is always really challenging. I think this one on the American Revolution will be as hard as anything we've done because of the the limited nature of the visual material that we have, but also because how contentious it is. It's a wonderful thing that something that started out as a dispute between Englishmen over property, over land and riches and representation, should have caused the igniting of one of the most powerful ideas, a distillation of and a practical application of the Enlightenment, and at the same time fail lots of people involved in the story. Fail completely lots of people involved in the story. And so that's a great story to try to tell, but it's daunting, at least at this period. Maybe I'll come back when it's done and we'll have another conversation. My father was an anthropologist, by the way.
Hi, I'm Nate Schneller, English major. I'm assuming that when you're making a film, it's very difficult to decide what goes in and like what has to stay out of it. So I'm just interested in that process, and also how, if there's anything like you thought should have been in some of your films or maybe even taken out.
So yeah, this is, it's the central thing of what I do. You've gotten at the heart of what it is. I live in New Hampshire. We make maple syrup. It takes 40 gallons of sap to make 1 gallon of maple syrup. Lots of stuff doesn't get in. And literally, we have a 40-to-1 ratio in most of the films of footage shot and material collected to footage and material used. And so it's an incredibly arduous thing to take something that's like an A or A minus and take it out of a film because it stops something. I've taken out scenes that were as beautiful as any we've made because it's complicated, and you found out that the dynamic of the thing is that you were experiencing fatigue about 10 minutes, 15 minutes later. And I've suddenly realized, well, if you take that out, and I told my writer and co-producer, and he just literally cried. And I said, just look, we'll put it back in, but let me just take it out. And we took it out, and the thing ran smoothly, and we put it back in, and it had the same problem. And finally, after 3 or 4 of that back and forth, just to honor his feelings about this beautiful scene, it's out. You know, we think about that all the time. And that there's millions of stories of that in which you have to honor the negative space of creation, right? I mean, you go to the theater and you see whatever the playwright did, or the movie theater, and you see whatever the director did, or whatever it might be. But those of us who are involved in the sausage making know what's not there as well, and you just have to honor that. It doesn't, like the rubble at a sculptress's studio. It's nothing you can make into part 2 or whatever. Hollywood does that all the time, but it's usually dreck. And but you can't sweep that up. But you have to understand that in order to make that sculpture, a lot of stuff has to be cut away. Do you know what I'm saying? And I don't think there's any rules or laws. As I was saying before, the material will speak to you. Scholars will speak to you. You'll have your own internal sets of things that are hard to really articulate or put into a manual that govern how you'll respond to material.
We have to honor Mr. Burns' schedule. He's got a busy night. I want to thank you all who asked questions. And please join me in celebrating Mr. Burns and his work.
Thank you. Thank you.
We do have a gift for Mr. Burns from the student body.
Alrighty. We just wanted to thank you really quickly. On behalf of the entire student body, we are really excited to have you here. Especially, this is a great opportunity for us not only to learn about history, cinematography, but also a great opportunity to learn about activism, especially as student leaders. So thank you for coming to Gettysburg.
Nice. Thank you very much. Thank you. Oh, wow, that's a good slide. Yeah. That looks great.